Welcome to Beneath the Branches, the podcast for the Adoption and Foster Care Clinic where we sit in the shade of shared experience. The heart is normalized and belonging is built one honest conversation at a time. Adoption, foster care, or kinship placement brings deep joy and real challenges, and we're here to talk about all of it. The hard, the heartwarming, and everything in between. So grab a cup of coffee, take a deep breath, and join us as we hold space for the messy, beautiful work of building connection beneath the branches.
Welcome back to the Adoption and Foster Care Clinic podcast. Today, I have with me again, Kelly and Caitlin, our therapist here at the Adoption Clinic, and I'm Dr. Chambers. Today, we're going to talk about transracial adoption. We have the benefit, as you guys know, of having the majority of our staff have either adopted or been adopted. And so today we're probably going to ask Kelly a lot of questions because she was transracially adopted. And then I have children that were transracially adopted. Caitlin was adopted domestically and not transracially.
Right.
So she's going to help us with some of the questions and ways that it's different. Mm-hmm. What was it like, Kelly, growing up in Alabama as an Asian in a predominantly white community?
Mm-hmm. Oh, man. So where I grew up, it is in like West Birmingham area. And I always say, like when I used to do a transracial adoption talk a lot. And when I pulled like the demographics, it was like 0.02% Asian in my community. But something I did appreciate and love is that even though there weren't a lot of people who looked like me, the community I grew up in, it was very almost like 50-50 white and black. So even though I didn't have a whole lot of other like racial mirrors for myself, that diversity was really important. It would have been better if there were other, Asian people that I could have looked to, but I did enjoy the fact that it was at least diverse in some way, shape, or form. I think it would have been a lot more difficult had it not been. But So just a little bit about my story is I was adopted at a little over 3 months from South Korea. To a very white family, again in West Birmingham. And so like all of my experiences were shaped by just kind of being under that umbrella of being raised and adopted by a white family. And so that part of my story was really hard. My parents did a lot of really great things. They were naturally attachment style and attachment leaning parents, but when it came to diversity, that was kind of the thing that was difficult as far as my story goes.
Mm-hmm. You said a word that I'd like to talk through. You said racial mirroring. What is racial mirroring? Where did that term, how do we define that term?
I mean, just in a very simple, and you speak on this too, but a very simple definition is like having other people that your kid or you can look to that looks like you. And for me, the only person I had in my community was Connie Chung on the news. I remember that very vividly. Is like she was the person that I looked to that I could like, oh wow, she has eyes that look like my eyes. She has hair that looks like my hair. So when I was growing up, that was my one and only racial mirror.
Wow. Yeah. And then so it was very different from being not transracially adopted, right. Caitlin.
Yeah. Yes.
Tell us your story a little bit.
Sure. Yes. I'll give you some of the high points. So I was adopted. The timeline, this always gets really fuzzy for me because talking about adoption and my family growing up was really hard. It's still hard. Adoption is a really painful topic for my parents because it highlights some things that they struggled with or still bring them a lot of sadness. And so the timeline of the things that took place for me are really fuzzy. Like I don't even think I have all of the right dates and things, but I do know that I was placed into a foster home. It was an Amish foster home, which is like a big laugh for me now because I could not imagine knowing who I am and who I have turned out to be, an Amish version of myself feels very ironic. I was in a foster home in the Blue Ridge Mountains to hear my mom tell the story of like the time they went to pick me up. It's very, very sweet and was a really wonderful moment for them, but it's very romanticized. So I was in a foster home anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks, I think. I'm not really sure. It had to do with the amount of time that my birth mother had to change her mind. That like there's a couple steps in the legal process in Virginia. And so they kept me in the foster home until like that first timeline hit. And then my parents picked me up from this Amish foster family somewhere around 8 months. I mean, not 8 months, 8 weeks of age, potentially 6, I'm not sure. And I was brought home to a sister who was also domestically adopted, but is 4 years older than me. And so I think the difference between like a transracial and a domestic adoption or where you're adopted into the same race that you are, is it's an invisible adoption. So people don't assume or know that you're adopted, which in some way grants a lot of freedom, but in some way it kind of erases the sadness and the grief that goes along with being adopted. And so that was definitely something that I had to contend with. And as I mentioned earlier, talking about adoption was really hard for my parents and still is. So that was like another layer to it. Like not only did everybody assume I was my parents' biological child, that's what my parents wanted also. They wanted everyone to assume that I was their biological kid. So that made my identity with adoption and understanding adoption so delayed in my life because there wasn't really space to talk about it freely.
That's so interesting, yeah, because my situation of parenting was much more like Kelly because my children, I am white and my children are Asian, and so there was never an opportunity to not talk about adoption. But also kind of interesting is that the first 2 children I adopted were babies. And so even though they were different racially, they were not different culturally, really the way they were raised. Whereas my third was adopted at 12. And so she brought with her not just her race, but also her culture. And so those are very different experiences as well. Definitely.
Okay, so you, I think, Dr. Chambers, you have a really unique experience in parenting, like those 2 dynamics you discussed. So I guess share a little bit about how that felt differently for you too as a mom, having these 2 littles that you are kind of, I'm sure that experience was like in stark contrast to your older child who was probably coming with some maybe even cultural expectations to experience here. So how did you respond to their needs and kind of meet those cultural needs and expectations?
Yeah, I mean, I had already done just your basic, let's celebrate Chinese New Year, let's eat at Chinese restaurants and those kinds of things. So I thought I was doing a really good job at it until, then when my oldest brought Chinese culture in, it opened my eyes of like how different our cultures were. And to make an older child like that feel comfortable, you do have to be very sensitive because there's an element now of culture shock that child's going through. And people kind of forget that. They just say, okay, we're working on attachment, we're working on transition, but that child is going through pretty significant culture shock. And so ways that I alleviated it, and then other of my patients are working on the same things, is just food. Food is very important. As you know, when you travel internationally, you're longing for your own favorites, right? And then especially if it's a difficult transition, that can bring you so much comfort. So learning to cook some of those dishes that were so important to my daughter and teaching others how to do that same thing is super important to me. And then celebrating definitely the same holidays are really important as well, so that there's a sense, because for us, like in just with the difference with Chinese culture, Christmas is not a huge deal, whereas Chinese New Year is a very, very big deal. So it ended up being Chinese New Year almost as big as Christmas in our family in order to kind of keep that culture going. And then just the way that I, encouraged dress and encouraged her holding on to her previous language, because language is such a part of culture. And not every child can keep their native language. Many are going to lose their native language. And luckily, in my situation, I knew that she did want to keep her language. It wasn't, it was a real obvious choice. But there was a lot of work to create that. There's a lot of finding safe TV shows, finding safe music, finding safe books, because I'm not reading Mandarin. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
So having to do all that homework of figuring out what is safe and what I can allow to continue was a lot of the work of keeping that culture.
When you say
going.
safe, will you, because that I think could be interpreted in a lot of different ways. So how did you identify safe for your kids?
Age appropriate.
There you go. Yeah.
So as far as the graphic, violence content, the romantic content, all of those different things, just keeping it age appropriate and not above where she was, because again, I'm having to just read reviews and figure out how to get these, how to get the content, understand the content, without having, being able to read the book or listen to the music, things like that. Yeah.
How did y'all find racial mirrors for your girls?
Racial mirroring was hard, like Kelly said, because we, at that, when my kids were little, we moved to Helena, which at that time it was less than 1% Asian, and also did not have other diversity there. So it was a predominantly white community. Yeah, no, it was very difficult to find racial mirrors in Helena at that time, because it was less than 1% Asian, and also not many other races. It was predominantly white. And then when we decided where we were going to put the children in school, that school was predominantly white, and we couldn't move because we moved there for my husband's job. And so we did something very difficult, and not everyone can do this, so I don't expect other people to do it, but it did work for us. So we asked a couple of other couples to make the move with us, so that on our cul-de-sac there was I can't remember how many kids it was, 7 children of the same age, and only one was born in the U.S.
Wow.
And then, so the majority were adopted from China. And so even though we were living in this place where we were the minority, the kids really just didn't have any clue of that, because all of their friends in the cul-de-sac were adopted from China or born outside America. So, and then when we went to make the school decision, we went to the other family who had Asian children and said, "Hey, would you like to make this decision with us?" And so they were all in the same grade at school, which really helped them a lot. Yeah.
I don't know if I've ever told you this, but after I started at the clinic initially, I was probably 25, and we came over to your house, and I walked away thinking, I have never been around so many Asian people at one time ever.
Oh, isn't that funny?
It's so fun, just the contrast,
Because the kids are running all in the house. Oh, that's so funny. Yeah.
I think that brings up an interesting distinction, though, is that there are different types of racial mirrors. So we have racial mirrors that are other kids who have shared experiences and look like us.
Yeah.
And then there are racial mirrors that are adults, that are representatives of our race and maybe even our culture that we can look up to. So did you guys have those racial mirrors for your kids, grown-up Chinese people that they were able to get to know?
Whether they liked it or not, yes. So we ended up just hanging out. There were 2 Chinese restaurants in Little Helena, and so we chose one, and we're we're going to be their friends. So we would go when it wasn't busy time, so we would go at the end of lunch, so that we could eat and hang out, and then we could become their friends.
Oh, that's great.
So we ended up, and then then they became like family to us. And so then when we did adopt our last child, who who only spoke Mandarin, then that's where we would hang out during hard days. We would
Sweet.
go there, and he would, the owner would help us
Yeah.
a good bit, you know. And so then when they had children, then we helped them with their kids, even though their kids weren't adopted.
Yeah.
So that was
Sweet.
probably our biggest. But we really had to do that. You just had to go and make yourself to be that
really
person,
intentional. It's
to
gonna
be
be so intentional.
super intentional, and it's a lot of time. You don't realize how much time is poured into creating racial mirrors for your child.
Yeah.
And then lately, we have found a Chinese church here in town that that one of my children would like to go to more often. You know, and so now that she's older, it's a lot easier. You know, she can do that a whole lot easier. Just convenience-wise, you know, she can drive, so she can do that. So,
Yeah. Kelly, so you made the comment of that time at Jennifer's house being when you were around the most Asian people ever. So I guess on the flip side, describe what it has been like for you to not have racial mirrors.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways I feel like maybe it's stunted a bit, like my like forming my identity. You know, I think that should I've had more racial mirrors, I think that like developing that may have been easier in some ways, because I remember starkly, you know, being a teenager. Teenagers are hard, like comparing like myself to a standard of beauty that was not my own, you know, because I only saw like beautiful Black girls and Black women and white girls and white women and not very many Asian women. And those things were something I was never going to achieve, you know? So I think it did probably seep in a little bit to my like self-worth and identity some. And I think that, of course, like having racial mirrors, it takes so much more than just having your kid around people that looks like them. But I think that that would have been an easier process. You know, I think that in some ways maybe that was stunted a little bit. And another experience I had, I remember after I started at the clinic, we got to travel to China. Again, not my culture, but it was so startling to me being around so many Asian people, because I had become so accustomed and so used to being the only one. And in a lot of ways, by that time, it had just become a part of my identity, like being that token Asian, you know, being the only Asian representative in mostly white spaces by that time. And so I remember it was like very jarring to be in China and being around like so many other people who looked more like me and less like you, you know? So I do think that that had a pretty big impact on just like my overall identity development.
I remember when the first time we went to China with my girls, my twins. I think there were 6. I mean, that was probably that same trip that we went on.
Maybe, yeah.
And I remember this is the first time they ever looked at me, and they were like, "You are so white." Do you know? I was like, okay, no, there's that realization. I am very white. They were 6.
So for adoptive parents maybe that are considering adoption, preparing to travel to meet their child, or already have their kiddos home, what advice would you give them as they are thinking about how to foster a positive racial identity for their kid?
I think kind of what we mentioned earlier, I think how you have to be so intentional about every move that you make. And it's uncomfortable. I mean, you can speak more to that than anybody, but you've got to like be able to break out of your comfort zone, or maybe you should think about not adopting transracially. You know, you've got to be willing to do the uncomfortable thing,
And to make friends with people that aren't your typical friends that you make friends with.
And it's not good enough that you work with someone who looks like your kid, you know, because your kid doesn't see that. It's got to be someone, you know, that your kid sees you interacting with and loving on regularly for that to have like a really good impact, you know. So I think being intentional is really huge.
And I think especially in the early stages is food. Again, food is so important, and maybe it's just important in our family.
No, it's important.
But you know, you can't really just bring home you know, a child from India and not give them some Indian food. You know, you also you want to prepare them, because say they do go off, you know, when they are independent and they're living on their own, they're not going to be viewed anymore as a child of this race who's adopted by you know,
Right.
a different race parents. They're just going to be viewed by that race.
Yeah,
you
they
know?
lose the protection of
Right.
being an adoptee, and they're now just a racial minority in the community.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. And so you don't want them to have no experience with their own culture. You know, like you don't want them to be like, yeah, I'm Chinese and I hate, you know, white rice. You know what I mean? Because that's something that they need, you know, they need to have a lot of exposure to their own culture so that they're ready for that independence to be able to identify with their own culture and race just to a certain degree. You know, every kid's different though.
Yeah.
Even amongst my three, they're very different on how much they want to identify with their country and culture.
That's, I mean, with my college students, that's what we work on the most is like,
Really?
because I don't think so many of them are not prepared for like stepping outside of their parents' like umbrella protection, you know, and then they get to college and then they don't fit anywhere, you know, they don't anymore fit with people who look like their parents and they don't really fit with people who are their same ethnic origin. So that's a really jarring experience for them to have.
Yeah, and you can soften that.
Yeah,
You can
yeah.
definitely soften that as a family.
Yeah.
Our family, we definitely consider, our identity of our family is Asian American. Do you know what I mean? That's not, my children aren't Asian.
Yeah.
I'm not just, it's an Asian American family
Yeah.
to help them kind of with that leap into independence and understanding their own identity.
And I think along the same lines, and this can be a whole nother episode, but preparing your children to encounter racism, you know, and microaggression, you know, I think that's really important. And it's something that I had to learn along the way, you know, and so I think that's another aspect of, you know, just parenting a transracially adopted child that you have to consider. And you've got to be willing to like step into that space and then find other people who can speak to that better than you can. Because as a white parent, you can only take that so far, you know.
Yeah.
You've got to have other people come and speak to your child, pour into your child that has more lived experience in that area.
And I think to be aware that when things are going to come up that are going to be difficult, like one thing I didn't realize until the week it was happening was like when the school was going to talk about racism, you know, the school was going to talk about slavery or, you know, things that had happened to Asians in America or blacks in America. It really was nice that they were not the only one of their race, and they're sitting in there in a room full of kids of another race, having to learn this, and now everybody looking at them going, "How do you feel? You're the only one." You know, I mean, that would have been a really hard week if I had not known that was coming. So.
Another thing too that I think is important for families to be aware of is how your church represents minorities, specifically your child's minority or your child's race.
Yeah.
So like if the only time your child sees another brown-skinned person is when they're the focus of mission work,
Right.
that's not okay. You know, like there are some undertone messages that are communicated there. So being able to like have the lens of your child in the places that you exist regularly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so building on to like how your child is able to view and experience their race, I think one of the things that we know is really important to lots of different racial communities is beauty, skincare, you know, hair care based on your child's race. The needs that they have just to take care of themselves is going to vary. And that's culturally really important. I know nothing stands out more than a child who is of another race that isn't able to blend in with their culture in the same way from like beauty standards. So could y'all share some, maybe what you've learned professionally helping families that are transracially parenting, and then also just yourselves of being in the experiences you are about those beauty standards in different cultures?
Well, first off, blue eyeshadow does not look good on Asians.
Kelly can share about that too.
Or white.
white shimmery eyeshadow.
Those pictures still come up to haunt me.
Yeah.
Tell us about the pictures, Kelly.
They're just random pictures on Facebook that like all of my friends, both from high school, my husband, my college friends, love to like reshare and talk about like how beautiful my white eyeshadow was at the time.
Because you were doing what your friends were doing.
Right.
Yes,
I was doing
yep.
what my friends were doing and it did not sit well.
Yeah.
You know.
Exactly.
You learn better, you do better.
But I will say, this is another topic for another day, but I had the pleasure of being able able to go to Korea with Kelly. And one of the things that was so overwhelmingly true was the beauty standards there are
unattainable.
I mean, they're insane, and there's so much culture focused on the beauty of like Korean women in particular.
Yes.
And so I think it really highlights the importance of helping our kids understand what the beauty expectations are, or just culture is for their race, so that way they can like fit in, you know, when they do launch into the community independently of their family. So yeah, y'all talk about that some.
I think that's such an important topic. I mean, I remember, you know, again, going through high school and like being in pageants or going to prom and different dances, getting my hair and makeup done. And I would walk out of like the salon or the galleria looking like a clown because no one knew how to do Asian makeup,
Did you have
including
glamour
myself.
shots? Did you have glamour
I
shots?
did have glamour
Oh
shots.
man, we need to find
We'll
those.
have to bring
We should
those
share our glamour shot photos one day.
Totally.
Some good ones.
Man, I mean, that was like really difficult though. You know, like again, none of my friends were Asian, so they couldn't help me. My mom, who's again very white, but also did not even wear a whole lot of makeup anyway. So she wouldn't have been able to help me anyways, you know? So I remember that being like really, really difficult. And like that made like just being typical, like just trying to fit in, even harder, you know? I think these days, some things that are really helpful, again, you gotta pick and choose what you watch and what you do on there, but YouTube, there's so many, like just for me in particular, there's so many like Korean, Asian channels now. Like on Facebook, there's a group dedicated to just Korean makeup, you know, and them teaching you how to do it. So I think that that's been one really great thing is like for people like me who didn't have a whole lot of racial mirrors, didn't know how to do a whole lot in regards to beauty and makeup, like that's been really impactful and really helpful because like you said, it's so important. And bringing it back to like when our kids are no longer under like the adoptee umbrella, like of their white parents, and they go to college, like if you can't blend in, that makes it even more difficult. So, and even in high school, even younger, you know, like you can tell adoptees if, you know, when you walk into a room or a place where adoptees are there, you can tell who the adoptees are a lot of times just based on like, what does their hair look like? You know, what type of makeup?
What kind of clothes are they wearing?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Definitely. And YouTube is great because, you know, a lot of our families who are white who've adopted black children, you know, that's how they're learning to do hair, which is so much a large part of that culture.
Right.
And it's important.
Yeah. And I don't feel like I can adequately speak to this, but I've heard from others just like not only like how your hair looks, but like the act of going to a barbershop.
Exactly. Yes.
You know, like having that experience is really, really, really important. So
and that's an easy way to bring racial mirrors to your child is wherever they get their hair cut. An easy way.
But uncomfortable for a lot of adoptive parents. But you've got to be willing to step out there. You know, like if you can't be uncomfortable for a few hours, you know, like just put yourself in your kid's shoes who has to live with that discomfort 24/7 all the time.
Exactly. Some of our children have, just because of history of living in an orphanage or just culturally having different genetics, then some of them are shorter than your typical American, you know, teenage boy, for example. And so that can be really difficult as a middle school teenage boy to have that shorter stature because of genetics.
Yeah.
I think too that it's important in closing to say like again like we have just talked about like a drop in the bucket.
A drop in the bucket, yes.
Like we need to spend. I feel like we need to do other podcasts that kind of breaks things down.
Yeah.
A little bit
Really
more.
dig in more on stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
And then people do need to know that's one of the main reasons middle school and teenagers and college age kids come to see both you and Kelly and Caitlin is for that mirroring, whether it's racially or wanting to have a fellow adoptee that's further down the line, help them. Those are the fun cases to me. A lot of our little ones that were here when we started the clinic, you know, 22 years ago are coming back and I get to see them kind of coming in and out of y'all's office. That's really fun.
Yeah. And then, so that one thing that I think we should say too, like in talking about all this stuff, racial mirrors, preparing, beauty standards, all of that is, and we've kind of talked about this in each piece, but really so much of this, the provision of this is dependent on the willingness of the adoptive parents and their ability to be uncomfortable. And like those two things are key. And you're gonna mess up. You know, I think that's giving yourself grace, but being willing to mess up and also not be the expert in this area, which is a really uncomfortable feeling as a parent when you're dealing with your child, you know, to be able to say like, this other person, this other community is the expert on this need that my child has, but you've got to be prepared to step into that, I think, as you're parenting transracially.
And make time for it.
Yeah,
it takes a lot of time
Yep.
To create these environments. They don't just happen naturally usually.
Right.
Because we tend to stick to our own race, unfortunately. So
Yeah, so I know we mentioned moving, like you moved, but you had family, you know, like not everybody can have other families move to you, but you may have to move to other families.
Yes.
You may have to intentionally enroll your child in a school that gives them the representation they need. You may have to change churches. You know, there's all sorts of things that.
Pick providers, doctors, dentists.
Yeah. You may have a pediatrician that you love that your other kids already see, and you may have to make that change for this particular child because the need is so great.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things too, just to tie back what we've already talked about some, is kind of the comparison of needs, how they show up between domestic adoptees who are not transracially adopted and intercountry, or like kind of there's some common threads that overlap. And I think one of the things that has been really funny personally over the last few years is like the times that Kelly and I find ourselves having like the same trauma response to being adopted, because there are a few overlaps. And so I think that is just important to point out that like adoption trauma shows up similarly for a lot of people regardless of race and transracial adoption, and a lot of the needs are still there. And I think the intention is almost different. With domestic adoptees, adoptive parents have to be intentional about talking about adoption. You know, with transracial, it's aware. It's something they face daily. It's there's like a spotlight all the time that their race is different from their families, which I think can, at times, make the conversation of topic around adoption be like a more day-to-day thing. With adoptees that are adopted by the same race parents, those parents need to be intentional to have those conversations, because you do hit a point where your family on the outside, you know, nobody can tell from looking at you that you have an adoptee in your family. An attachment feels seamless at some point. It feels very natural, and it can feel strange to bring up adoption when everything feels so cohesive. And so there has to be this level of intentionality around talking about adoption and these invisible adoptions. And there's a lot of ways parents can do that. I know commonly the term has been gotcha day, which is like a little creepy and aggressive.
Don't love it.
There's a lot of different names people can use, like family day or homecoming day, or I don't know, whatever you want to use, that are not quite as intense. But marking that on your calendar and not having a party every time, but using that time to reflect with your child on their adoption, answer their questions, go through some of their adoption paperwork, whatever you have on hand, and have those intentional conversations, because it's important, because domestic adoptees need those. I keep saying domestic, but really, I mean adoptees, same race adoptees need those opportunities to be reminded, like, hey, we see this big thing that happened and we want to talk about it, and we want to give you the opportunity to share your feelings, whatever they may be, on being an adoptee. So.
And that's going to change depending on the developmental age of the child.
Yes.
You know, so it always needs to be presented in some form or fashion throughout the development of the child.
Yes, absolutely.
And there's going to be ages and stages where your kid wants nothing to do with it, you know,
Exactly.
where your kid just wants to be the same as their peers and everyone else. And that's okay. You know, I think the important thing is, as a parent, you're being really intentional about leaving that door open for those really hard conversations to happen.
Yeah. And I think Kelly and I can both say, and Dr. Chambers too, some of the favorite clients we see, or our favorite work that we get to do is working with adoptees that are processing their story, that are working to figure out how their identity as an adoptee, as a transracial adoptee, how it fits into the world for them. And we love to work with those clients and see them come in.
Yeah. it's a unique perspective that others can't give them. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
well, thank you.
Thank you for joining the Adoption and Foster Care Clinic for another episode of Beneath the Branches, a podcast for adoptive, foster, and kinship care families. We are deeply grateful to our sponsor, Show Hope, for their generous support in their continued work to break down barriers to adoption and support families every step of the way. Until next time, may you feel covered, connected, and never alone beneath the branches.